What's up, party people? It's KeysDAN with RadioWhat.com, DJLittleRock.com, coming to you live and in living color from the Radio What studios. And this is my podcast, What Makes You Smarter. It's an extension of the RadioWhat.com internet radio station that I've been running for quite some time. And if you need DJ services, where do you go? DJLittleRock.com, DJLittleRock.com. Check availability and get a free price quote. And maybe you can have me at your next event. And you can sing for me. Yeah, I do karaoke shows too. Weddings and parties and corporate events and all that kind of stuff. All the usual stuff you'd want some good music playing at. You know, I conform to you. I become who you want me to be. I'll play the music you want me to play. I'll be the entertainer that you want me to be. I conform to you. Speaking of you, if you would like to tell your story, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. But for today, let's learn together on What Makes You Smarter. Now, on with the show. Today on the program, John Tenniel. Sir John Tenniel was born on the 28th of February, 1820, and died on the 25th of February, 1914. He was an English illustrator, graphic humorist, and political cartoonist prominent in the second half of the 19th century. He was knighted for his artistic achievements in 1893. Tenniel is remembered especially as the principal political cartoonist for Punch magazine for over 50 years and for his illustrations to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, 1865, and Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, both in 1871. Let's go through the early life of John Tenniel. Tenniel was born in Bayswater, West London, to John Baptist Tenniel, a fencing and dancing master of Huguenot descent, and Eliza Maria Tenniel. Tenniel had 5 siblings, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. One sister, Mary, was later to marry Thomas Goodwin Green, owner of the pottery that produced Cornish ware. Tenniel was a quiet and introverted person, both as a boy and as an adult. He was content to remain firmly out of the limelight and seemed unaffected by competition or change. His biographer, Rodney Engen, wrote that Tenniel's, quote, life and career was that of the supreme gentlemanly outside, living on the edge of respectability, end quote. In 1840, Tenniel, while practicing fencing with his father, received a serious eye wound from his father's foil, which had accidentally lost its protective tip. Over the years, Tenniel gradually lost sight in his right eye. He never told his father of the severity of the wound, as he did not wish to upset his father further. In spite of his tendency towards high art, Tenniel was already known and appreciated as a humorist, and his early companionship with Charles Keene fostered and developed his talent for scholarly caricature. And John Tenniel's training. Tenniel became a student of the Royal Academy of Arts in 1842 by probation. He was admitted because he had made enough copies of classical sculptures to fill the necessary admission portfolio. So it was here that Tenniel returned to his earlier independent education. While Tenniel's more formal training at the Royal Academy and other institutions was beneficial in nurturing his artistic ambitions, it failed in Tenniel's mind because he disagreed with the school's teaching methods and so set about educating himself for his career. Tenniel studied classical sculptures through painting. However, he was frustrated in this because he lacked instruction in drawing. Tenniel would draw the classical statues at London's Townley Gallery, copy illustrations from books of costumes and armor in the British Museum, and draw animals from the zoo in Regent's Park, as well as actors from London's theaters, which he drew from the pits. These studies taught Tenniel to love detail, yet he became impatient in his work and was happiest when he could draw from memory. Though he was blessed with a photographic memory, it undermined his early format training and restricted his artistic ambitions. Another, quote, formal, end quote, means of training was Tenniel's participation in an artists' group, free from the rules of the academy that were stifling him. In the mid-1840s, he joined the Artists' Society, or Clipstone Street Life Academy, and it could be said that Tenniel first emerged as a satirical draftsman. Let's go through John Tenniel's early career. Tenniel's first book illustration was for Samuel Carter Hall's The Book of British Ballads in 1842. While engaged with his first book illustrations, various contests were taking place in London as a way in which the government could combat the growing Germanic Nazarene style and promote a truly national English school of art. Tenniel planned to enter the 1845 House of Lords competition amongst artists to win the opportunity to design the mural decoration of the new Palace of Westminster. Despite missing the deadline, he submitted a 16-foot or 4.9 meter cartoon, an allegory of justice, to a competition for mural decorations of the new Palace of Westminster. For this, he received a £200 premium and a commission to paint a fresco in the upper waiting hall, or Hall of Poets, in the House of Lords. Moving on through John Tenniel's life. Punch. As the influential result of his position as chief cartoonist for Punch, John Tenniel remained Britain's steadfast witness to sweeping changes in political and social reform through satirical, often radical, and at times vitriolic images of the world. At Christmas 1850, he was invited by Mark Lemon to fill the position of joint cartoonist with John Leech on Punch, having been selected on the strength of recent illustrations to Aesop's Fables. He contributed his first drawing in the initial letter appearing on page 224, volume 19. This was entitled, quote, Lord Jack, the Giant Killer, end quote, and showed Lord John Russell assailing Cardinal Wiseman. In 1861, Tenniel was offered John Leech's position at Punch as political cartoonist, but Tenniel still maintained a sense of decorum and restraint in the heated social and political issues of the day. His task was to follow the willful choices of his Punch editors, who probably took their cue from the Times and would have felt the suggestions of political tensions from Parliament as well. Tenniel's work could be scathing in effect. The restlessness in the issues of working class radicalism, labor, war, economy, and other national themes were the targets of Punch, which in turn settled the nature of Tenniel's subjects. His cartoons of the 1860s popularized a portrait of the Irishman as a subhuman being, wanton in his appetites and resembling an orangutan in facial features and posture. Many of Tenniel's political cartoons expressed strong hostility to Irish nationalism, with Fenians and land leagues depicted as monstrous, ape-like brutes, while, quote, Hibernia, end quote, the personification of Ireland, was depicted as a beautiful, helpless girl threatened by such, quote, monsters, end quote, and turning for protection to an, quote, elder sister, end quote, in the shape of a powerful armored Britannia. Quote, an unequal match, end quote. His drawing published in Punch on the 8th of October, 1881, depicted a police officer fighting a criminal with only a baton for protection, trying to put a point across to the public that policing methods needed to be changed. While examined separately from the book illustrations he did over time, Tenniel's work at Punch alone, expressing decades of editorial viewpoints, often controversial and socially sensitive, was created to echo the voices of the British public. Tenniel drew 2,165 cartoons for Punch, a liberal and politically active publication that mirrored the Victorian public's mood for liberal social changes. Thus, Tenniel, in his cartoons, represented for years the conscience of the British majority. Tenniel contributed around 2,300 cartoons, innumerable minor drawings, many double-page cartoons for Punch's Almanac and other specials, and 250 designs for Punch's pocketbooks. By 1866, he could, quote, command 10 to 15 guineas for the reworking of a single Punch cartoon as a pencil sketch, end quote, alongside his, quote, comfortable, end quote, Punch salary of, quote, about £800 a year, end quote. Moving forward through Sir John Tenniel's life, Alice. Despite the thousands of political cartoons and hundreds of illustrative works attributed to him, much of Tenniel's fame stems from his illustrations for Alice. Tenniel drew 92 drawings for Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, London, Macmillan, 1865, and Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, London, Macmillan, 1871. Lewis Carroll originally illustrated Wonderland himself, but his artistic abilities were limited. Orlando Jewett, who had worked for Carroll in 1859 and reviewed Carroll's drawings for Wonderland, suggested that he employ a professional. Carroll was a regular reader of Punch and therefore familiar with Tenniel, who in 1865 had long talks with Carroll before illustrating the first edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The first print run of 2000 was sold in the United States rather than England because Tenniel objected to the print quality. A new edition was released in December 1865, carrying an 1866 date, and became an instant bestseller, increasing Tenniel's fame. His drawings for both books have become some of the most famous literary illustrations. After 1872, when the Carroll projects were finished, Tenniel largely abandoned literary illustration. Carroll did later approach Tenniel to undertake another project for him. To this, Tenniel replied, "It is a curious fact that with Looking Glass, the faculty of making drawings for book illustrations departed from me, and I have done nothing in that direction since." Tenniel's illustrations for the Alice books were engraved onto blocks of deal wood by the brothers Daziel. These engravings were then used as masters for making the electrotype copies for the actual printing of the books. The original wood blocks are held in the collection of the Bodleian Library in Oxford. They are not usually on public display, but were exhibited in 2003. Let's go through John Tenniel's style. Influence of German Nazarenes. The style associated with the Nazarene movement of the 19th century influenced many later artists, including Tenniel. It can be characterized as, quote, shaded outlines, end quote, where the lines on the side of figures or object are given extra thickness or drawn double to suggest shading or volume. Furthermore, this style is extremely precise, with the artist making a hard, clear outline for its figures, dignifying them and the compositions, while giving restraint in expression and paleness of tone. Though Tenniel's early illustrations in the Nazarene style were not well received, his encounter with the style pointed him in a good direction. He had an eye for detail. After the 1850s, Tenniel's style was modernized to incorporate more detail in backgrounds and in figures. The inclusion of background details corrected the previously weak dramatic staging of his illustrations. Tenniel's more precisely designed illustrations depicted specific moments of time, locale, and individual character, instead of just generalized scenes. In addition to a change in specificity of background, Tenniel developed a new interest in human types, expressions, and individualized representation, something that would carry over to his illustrations of Wonderland. Referred to by many as theatricality, this hallmark of Tenniel's style probably stemmed from his earlier interest in caricature. In Tenniel's first years on Punch, he developed this caricaturist's interest in the uniqueness of persons and things, almost giving a human-like personality to the objects in the environment. For example, a comparison of one of John Everett Malias's illustrations of a girl in a chair with Tenniel's illustration of Alice in a chair shows clearly that Malias's chair is just a prop, whereas Tenniel's chair possesses a menacing and towering presence. Another change in style was his shaded lines. These transformed from mechanical horizontal lines to vigorously hand-drawn hatching that greatly intensified darker areas. Tenniel's grotesque. Tenniel's grotesque was one reason why Lewis Carroll wanted Tenniel as his illustrator for the Alice books, in the sense of imparting a disturbing sense that the real world may have ceased to be reliable. Tenniel's style was characteristically grotesque through his dark, atmospheric compositions of exaggerated fantasy, creatures carefully drawn in outline. Often, the mechanism was to use animal heads on recognizable human bodies, or vice versa, as Granville had done in the Parisian satirical journal Charivari. In Tenniel's illustrations, the grotesque is found also in mergers of beings and things, deformities in and violence to the human body. For example, when Alice drinks the potion and grows huge, and a proclivity to deal with ordinary things of this world while presenting such phenomena. The most noticeably grotesque is Tenniel's famous Jabberwock drawing in Alice. The Alice illustrations combine fantasy and reality. Scholars such as Morris trace Tenniel's stylistic change to the late 1850s trend towards realism, for the grotesque to operate, quote, "It is our world which has to be transformed and not some fantasy realm," end quote. The illustrations constantly but subtly remind us of the real world, as do some of Tenniel's scenes, derived from a medieval town, the portico of a Georgian town, or the checked jacket on the white rabbits. Additionally, Tenniel closely follows Carroll's text so that the reader sees the similitude between the written text and the illustrations. These touches of realism help to convince readers that all these seemingly grotesque inhabitants of Wonderland are simply themselves, simply real, not just performing. Now let's go through the image and text in Alice. One unusual aspect of the Alice books is the placing of Tenniel's illustrations on the pages. The physical relation of illustrations to text meshes them together. Carroll and Tenniel expressed this in various ways. One was bracketing. Two relevant sentences would bracket an image as a way of imparting the moment that Tenniel was trying to illustrate. This bracketing of Tenniel's pictures with the text adds to their, quote, dramatic immediacy, end quote. However, other, less frequent illustrations work with text as captions. Another link between illustration and text is the use of broader and narrower illustrations. Broader ones are meant to be centered on the page, narrower to be, quote, let in, end quote, or run flush to the margin alongside a narrow column of continuing text. Still, words run in parallel with the depiction of those things. For example, when Alice says, quote, "Oh, my poor little feet," end quote, it not only occurs at the foot of the page, but is right next to her feet in the illustration. Some of these narrower illustrations are, quote, L-shaped, end quote, and of great importance as some of his most memorable work. The top or base of these illustrations runs the full width of the page, but the other end leaves room on one side for text. There are many books that Sir John Tenniel illustrated. Some of the most famous ones are Juvenile Verse and Picture Book, 1846, Aesop's Fables, 1848, Shirley's Books, The Gordian Knot, 1860, Shirley's Books, The Silver Cord, 1861, Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, as we've gone over in great length, 1866, Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, 1870, Lewis Carroll's The Nursery, Alice, 1890. Quite a few different collaborations that he's had. Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, 1858, and The Arabian Nights, 1863. The list, there's quite a big list, but I'm sure you can look that up on your own. I don't need to drone about that. I've already droned on enough. Let's continue Sir John Tenniel's retirement and death. An ultimate tribute came to an elderly Tenniel as he was knighted for public service in 1893 by Queen Victoria. It was the first such honor ever bestowed on an illustrator or cartoonist. His fellows saw his knighthood as gratitude for, quote, raising what had been a fairly lowly profession to an unprecedented level of respectability, end quote. With his knighthood, Tenniel elevated the social status of the black and white illustrator and sparked a new sense of recognition of his profession. When he retired in January 1901, Tenniel was honored with a farewell banquet on the 12th of June, at which A.J. Balfour, then leader of the House of Commons, presided. Tenniel died on the 25th of February 1914, 3 days before his 94th birthday. He was buried in Kensal Green Cemetery in London. Sir John Tenniel left a legacy. The Punch historian M.H. Spielman, who knew Tenniel, wrote that the political clout contained in his Punch cartoons was capable of, quote, swaying parties and people too, end quote. 2 days after his death, the Daily Graphic recalled how Tenniel, quote, had an influence on the political feeling of his time, which is hardly measurable. While Tenniel was drawing them, his subjects, we always looked to the Punch cartoon to crystallize the national and international situation and the popular feeling about it, and never looked in vain. This social influence resulted from the weekly publishing of his political cartoons over 50 years, whereby Tenniel's fame allowed for a want and need for his particular illustrative work away from the newspaper. Tenniel became not only one of Victorian Britain's most published illustrators, but as Punch cartoonist, one of the, quote, supreme social observers, end quote, of British society, and an integral component of a powerful journalistic force. The New York Tribune journalist George W. Smalley referred to John Tenniel in 1914 as, quote, one of the greatest intellectual forces of his time, who understood social laws and political energies, end quote. Public exhibitions of Sir John Tenniel's work were held in 1895 and 1900. Tenniel was also the author of one of the mosaics, Leonardo da Vinci, in the South Court in the Victoria and Albert Museum. His stippled watercolor drawings appeared from time to time in the exhibitions of the Royal Institute of Painters in Watercolors, to which he had been elected in 1874. Tenniel Close, a Braeswater street near his former studio, is named after him. On the 28th of February 2020, Google celebrated his 200th birthday with a Google Doodle. That's a little bit about Sir John Tenniel. Amazing life, amazing illustrator. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to check out a library. Read Alice in Wonderland or one of his many other works, Aesop's Fables. They're a hoot. This has been What Makes You Smarter. It's KeysDAN. I thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to tell your story, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. That's it for me. What Makes You Smarter? It's KeysDAN. RadioWhat.com, DJLittleRock.com. Peace. I'm out of here. If you like what you hear, I encourage you to follow What Makes You Smarter on social media. Find it on Facebook at What Makes You Smarter, Instagram at What Makes You Smarter, Twitter at SmarterWhat, and YouTube. Username KeysDAN. Leave What Makes You Smarter podcast a review and subscribe. Listen to What Makes You Smarter podcast on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Podcast Addict. My personal favorite, learn with me on my podcast, What Makes You Smarter. And if you'd like to tell your story, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. Call 501-470-6386 and leave a message to set up a time for What Makes You Famous. Support What Makes You Smarter podcast using the PayPal, paypal.me/KeysDAN. Email info@radiowhat.com. What Makes You Smarter is a production of KeysDAN Enterprises Incorporated at KeysDAN.com. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. Thank you.